Right. Every single time I hear the Final Fantasy prelude, it always gives me chills. Like the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I just love that. The scales. Like it's just simple scales, and that's all it really is, with a little bit of strings coming in, and I just love that track. Nobu Uematsu is like a genius when it comes to, because he still does it today, but when it comes to putting together these amazing soundtracks for all the Final Fantasy games. And he's done other ones too, but like this guy is a genius. I'll be sad when he's gone because nobody's been able to follow in his footsteps in terms of soundtracking RPGs, but goddamn, the Final Fantasy series has like hit after hit after hit. And
yeah, I mean the main prelude, just it's right up there with the Halo theme and all that for me, of just like the most iconic video game music ever. And anytime I hear it, just takes me back to my teenage years in high school and playing those games in my bedroom and stuff like that. And oh man, it means everything to me.
Yeah, and the prelude itself is just a simple track. It's like nothing too extravagant like some of the other songs are. I don't know. It like you said, it's very iconic for the series, and it's in every single game. And it doesn't matter what version you hear, you're going to have memories of playing a Final Fantasy game if you were into them back in the day. It just instantly hits that spot.
Yeah, it's right up there with like the Super Mario Brothers theme or like the Tetris theme as far as like the most iconic video game music. I think almost anyone that, even people kind of outside of games that just know about them, tangentially, they kind of almost recognize the main Final Fantasy prelude, because even if they didn't play them, they probably had a family member or a friend and that they saw playing it at some point, and so it's very, very striking.
So this was actually another thing that Joseph Mannion wrote in for. He said Final Fantasy games instantly bring him into the Final Fantasy world. So that's my boy. He loved the Devil May Cry reboot soundtrack, and he loves the Final Fantasy soundtracks too. So me and him are on the same wavelength for sure for video game music. Let's start this off by just picking out the most iconic Final Fantasy game, that is Final Fantasy VII. I'm going to throw it to Zyzer. Go ahead.
Yeah, so as I've said probably on one of these podcasts before, and I'll probably say it again many times in the future, is that Final Fantasy VII was a real sort of watershed moment for me when it comes to video games. That's the first RPG I'd ever played. I'd never played a game quite like it at that point, and I didn't know video games could be that big and epic and important. All that storytelling, the characters, everything in that game is iconic. It basically changed everything for me, because from that point on, I took video games a lot more serious. And so the Final Fantasy soundtrack is very important to me, or Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, I should say. It's very important to me. Basically, every track from that soundtrack is just burned into my brain, and every one of them stands out to me. There's almost no song off there that I wouldn't pick to put in this podcast or listen to. The ones that I did pick that were sort of my favorites, I guess. One is called Genova. It's a really cool little track. And then there's this other one, which is probably one of the least interesting songs from that soundtrack. It's called Under the Rotting Pizza. And I don't know why, but to this day, every once in a while, I'll just be going about my daily life, and this song will pop into my head. There's just something about the little bass line, the boo doo 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 bo. I don't know. It'll just pop in my head at random for no reason, unprovoked. And so this, just everything about that soundtrack is so important to me. That game was so important to me.
So that Under the Rotting Pizza song, that's the one that plays when you're in Midgar, kind of in the beginning of the game, and you're in the slums, right?
Yep.
Like before Avalanche blows up the pillar.
Yeah, it's right at the beginning of the game. Yeah.
That's the one. It's funny because I played the game three times through, so I don't know how many hours that is. But also being familiar with the music outside the game, when I hear the music outside the game, I like know what part of the game that song is in.
Yeah, that's another interesting aspect of it is like, because you even knew what part of the game that was from that I was talking about. And every time there's like a certain track that plays from the soundtrack, I can almost pinpoint the exact moment in the game, the cutscene or whatever story beat was involved in that part.
Yeah, it didn't have too many. It didn't repeat the tracks too often. There were specific tracks that would play like the battle theme. Certain scenes had their own songs, so they were very specific to that part of the game.
Well, that's kind of like a trope of JRPGs in general, though. Like they always have these specific, like you go into a certain town, or you go into a certain dungeon, and it has its own track or song or whatever that's unique to that part of the game. So it's very easy to identify in that way because a lot of JRPGs kind of do that.
Yeah, but none were as iconic as Final Fantasy VII and a lot of the other Final Fantasy games. Because I don't remember like a lot of soundtracks for the RPGs that I play. They're mostly forgettable. And to have like bangers like this, like one after another, just great, amazingly composed songs that have lasted the test of time.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other JRPGs out there that even come close to any of the music in any Final Fantasy game. I don't really remember 8 too much, but 9 is another one in particular. Like I talked about last week, the Final Fantasy 9 soundtrack was actually one of the first video game soundtracks that I bought to actually listen to outside of the game.
Yeah, 9 had some really good ones too. It wasn't one of my favorites. It's maybe like number 3 or 4 on my list. I would say Final Fantasy VII is my first, and then I'd probably pick Final Fantasy X because I don't know, it was one of the first games that like went to the next gen for the Final Fantasy series, and it caught me.
I don't remember that soundtrack. I need to go back and listen to that because Final Fantasy X was one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, so I don't really remember that soundtrack though, but I need to go back and check it out because I'm sure it's probably just as good as anything else.
The whole thing isn't great. A lot of the songs are really good. It took it out of the 8-bit, 16-bit type tracks and it brought it into like more modernly composed music. But another good soundtrack is the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack. It has a lot of good tracks on that too. Kind of segue into this is I'm a huge sucker for overworld themes. So for those listening that don't know what an overworld is, it's basically when like you leave town and you're on like the world map and you're walking around and you're running into random encounters and stuff. And the Final Fantasy series in particular has really great overworld themes. So Final Fantasy,
which is super important because you spend a lot of your time in the game in those overworlds, so it's always nice to have a good tune. So yeah, it makes me think of another game, The Witcher 3, which also has an overworld theme that you hear over and over and over and over again in that game that really sticks out in your mind. So any game, I think it's important to an RPG to have a really good overworld theme or song because that's what you're going to be listening to the most, really.
When they released the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII separately, they actually had a whole bunch of orchestrated versions of certain songs. So they had the main theme that was orchestrated, which translated perfectly. Like, I would say the orchestrated version is like the definitive version of the Final Fantasy VII main theme. And they did Sephiroth's theme as well, that plays throughout.
Sephiroth's theme, that's a good one.
Yeah, they did that with an orchestra, and it just, again, like, Nobuo, like, he wrote this stuff classically. He wrote it like he was writing for an orchestra, and he just put it into these games using whatever sounds he could for, like, the 8-bit, 16-bit eras and whatnot. And it just makes sense that these work well in an orchestrated setting.
I'm pretty sure I've heard that song before. I can't place it at the moment because, like I said, I came on board with Final Fantasy VII, so I wish people had introduced me to this genre before then, because I would have loved to play things like Final Fantasy VI, which a lot of people say is actually the best Final Fantasy. A lot of old school fans think that's even better than 7. And old games like Chrono Trigger.
And you mentioned Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger had some really great tracks in it, but I actually really liked Chrono Cross. It's not a sequel. It takes place kind of like in the same universe. I can kind of say it has to do with time travel.
Yeah, I played it a little bit. I kind of bounced off of it. I wasn't really vibing with that game too much.
The combat system was really weird in Chrono Cross. Like, it was a bit different. It took a bit more because you had like a certain amount of like attack points, and then there was different elements, and it's just a weird system. But the music in that game is just as good as anything else, and the overworld theme in that game is I don't know. I just really love it. It's like, it's very haunting. It's kind of sad, but it's a very strange song to me. Like, I feel different things about it, but I always thought it was a very iconic overworld theme, and it's one of my favorite overworld themes. It's probably right up there with Final Fantasy VI's Terra's theme. Lastly, since I'm still talking about overworld themes, Final Fantasy VII's Cid's theme. It's the theme that plays when you finally get into the airship and you're in the overworld and you're flying all over the place. It's basically endgame. But Cid's theme has always stuck with me as one of the best songs from the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack. I've always enjoyed that theme. It just has like a military type snare drum roll stuff, and it has that emotion in it too, where it's like, okay, the band is together. We have to face the final battle. Here we go. Let's do it. We can do this. And I feel that in that song.
Yeah, it's not one of my favorite tracks off that Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, but it's definitely iconic and sticks out in my head.
So talking about Final Fantasy, we had Tim Brown write in, and he said that Final Fantasy Tactics was one of his favorite soundtracks, and is still hands down in the top 3 games of all time for him, right beside Castlevania Symphony of the Night and the Secret of Mana soundtrack for the SNES. So Secret of Mana had some great music too, and see, there's a theme here. It's all Square games. So it's all that wheelhouse for those guys. They knew what they were doing. They basically paved the way for RPGs.
Yeah, I mean, that was the golden era of Square. Before it was Square Enix, it was Squaresoft, and pretty much almost everything they came out with during the sort of mid to late 90s was just, I mean, everything in video games. Everyone was playing those games back then. That was before open world games and stuff really took off, so those were kind of the open world games of their time. But yeah, anything Squaresoft put out back in that day was very, very tremendous.
And it's crazy. It's like they were printing money, and it's not like they were the only dog in the yard. They had like Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, as it was called originally, and a couple other series. But for sure, like Squaresoft had that market cornered.
Even like Xenogears, I don't know if you played that,
Yeah,
but that's right up there with like Final Fantasy VII for me for like greatest JRPGs of all time. Did you play Final Fantasy Tactics at all? Because I played a little bit, but I kind of bounced off of it. It wasn't really the same thing that I sort of came to Final Fantasy games for, so I didn't really appreciate it as much. But it's kind of a sort of secret, not really secret, but a special game that a lot of people really loved.
I did play it at the time. I didn't really care for it because I don't know. I was a bit too young and I didn't really understand what's going on. I found the game to be hard. I'm sure if I played it today, I won't have an issue if I play it today. But back then, it was difficult, and I think that turned me off.
Yeah, I couldn't really wrap my head around it at the time. Like I got like maybe a third of the way into it, and I was just fucking dying over and over in some of those levels, and I was just like, "Fuck this shit."
Yeah, because you can't save, right? So you get screwed. You have to do the whole thing over again. The battles are like 40 minutes long or more.
Yeah,
big investment.